turn this sucker on. Okay, great. All right, so you are recording. And can you give me a test there, Kathy?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I gotcha. Okay, great. I can edit this
Excellent.
out. All right, fantastic. So welcome back, everyone. We are speaking with Kathy Lang. This is SEMP 1001, Perspectives on Social Entrepreneurship and Innovation. And you're actually pretty excited because Kathy was one of the editors on your course text. Isn't that great? So Kathy, tell us a little bit about you. Tell us what's on your business card.
Okay. Well, I would say I'm a not-for-profit consultant, so that's a very broad categorization of what I do. But my work has, just to give you some of my background, my work started as a community developer and social worker, and so working with social issues. At the time that I was studying, I was working very much in the inner city of Toronto, so dealing with issues of poverty reduction and homelessness and that sort of thing. And through that work, I discovered that there were ways that one could organize people to address some of the issues that they were facing in a sort of a collective way. And so I got very interested in cooperatives. And cooperatives are one of the oldest forms of social enterprise. They've been around a long time. They're about community self-determination. There are cooperative acts in every province and federally. And so I wanted to go back and study this form of social enterprise and social entrepreneurship as a way for communities to address some of their own issues. And so I went back to do grad school. I did adult ed. And in there I studied a lot about cooperatives and social organizational forms. And that's how I got into social enterprise. And I spent 15 years working in the cooperative sector, trying to use various ways to create what I envisioned as a more cooperative economy, an economy where people were more engaged in the solutions that would address their own issues. So my business card is really related to supporting communities and not-for-profits to address their issues in very innovative ways, in entrepreneurial ways, because the cooperative sector was very, very entrepreneurial, but also in ways that recognize certain principles and values of equity and as I said, self-help. And so really, I look to support nonprofits to utilize innovative approaches to address community issues where hopefully the community is engaged in some of that work.
That's awesome. So how do you define engagement?
Well, that's an interesting question when you think about social enterprise and social entrepreneurship, because remember, my background, as I just said, was community development, and that is mobilizing people to become conscious of what they need, to articulate that, to voice it, and then to do problem solving and strategize around what would be, strategic ways to resolve some of those issues. So engagement is really getting those conversations going, is talking with community about what's needed, and then envisioning alternatives. And I think that's, for me, much of the fun part is envisioning the alternatives. Now, in the context of social enterprise, and I'm sure you'll ask me more questions about this in social entrepreneurship these days, I find that the movement for social entrepreneurship is quite individualistic, and that's my opinion. It's not horrible, it's not a bad thing, but it also means that individuals who have wonderful ideas may be less engaged with the communities that they're trying to resolve issues with. And so my work has always been to bridge that engagement, to talk to community, to envision solutions that they could stand by, that really fit for them. And I think that's really important for people in social entrepreneurship these days, is to really challenge themselves to work with the creativity that they have, the problem solving, the solution finding that is a big part of social entrepreneurship, but also to engage community in those conversations about what's going to work for them and how they can be involved in the solutions.
That's cool. So what about, do you have an example of somewhere where you have done that, where, you've taken that individual and they've engaged? Like, do you have a great example of how that...
Yeah, so much of my work in cooperatives was that, which is why I so loved it. We might have a community, a farming community that I'm trying to think needed a market for their goods, and they also recognized that there was a lack of jobs in their community. And so they formed a cooperative and created and so the farmers talked to each other. We had community meetings. We talked about how you get the capital to actually do this. And I'm remembering one where it was actually a plant that was processing cheese, and that was closed down by a multinational. And that meant that there was no place to process the milk of certain farmers. And at that time, we mobilized and worked with the goat milk producers, who were very young farmers, actually, very sort of leading edge. They were kind of the new, because it wasn't as expensive to get into raising goats. And they created some very interesting models for cooperatives where the community purchased the plant. The cooperative was the anchor tenant. There were other tenants in the plant. So then now we had community members who were supporting the producers, jobs that were being created in the plant, a market or at least a processing facility for the goat producers. So that meant younger goat producers could have a place to process. And it was just this win-win-win-win for the whole community, where there was a high level of engagement. That's a particular cooperative example. That was in southwestern Ontario, and I won't give the names because I don't know where that particular plant is at right now. But it was a very exciting example of a community kind of taking back their economy when a multinational pulled out. On a much smaller scale, I'm trying to think about entrepreneurs that might be taking your course. They might be people who are working within a particular not-for-profit, and there's an idea that there might be a revenue-generating model to address a certain issue. And all I would say there, and I can't think of a particular example right off the top, but I'll give you an example of a group that did work this way, a group of parents of people with intellectual disabilities. And one parent who had a particularly rowdy and wonderful daughter who loved baking, decided that she wanted to do baking, and that was what she wanted as a job. And that mother, as an individual social entrepreneur, could have just left it at that and had her daughter make cookies and maybe sell them somewhere. But because she decided she wanted to extend and scale the impact of that idea, and she knew so many parents of children who had adult children who had intellectual disabilities, she decided to mobilize the parents, so that's the engagement level, and she got them together and said, what if your son, my daughter, 3 others got together and we formed a business, and then we provided cooperative support for that business. And from that, they sought a lawyer. The lawyer developed a very innovative model. It's called Common Ground Cooperative. And within that, and as an umbrella, that cooperative provides administrative services and support, applies for funding for job coaches, and they helped support the development of at least 5 or 6 business partnerships that were owned and operated by people with intellectual disabilities. So there's an example of something where it started with one person and their mom and dad who knew they would be needing something lifelong, a place to generate some revenue for themselves, to have the dignity of a job, to have fun and have some some interaction with the community, and they created it into a scaled up enterprise with at least, I would say now, probably at least 60 adults with intellectual disabilities working within, and again, I don't know the particulars these days, at least 6 business partnerships that do everything from baking to catering to they have a toy cleaning service for agencies that provide toys for clients to use as part of their therapy, and so on. So there's a great example of engagement. One person, one social entrepreneurial idea moves into 60, scales to 60 in just one community. And that particular model, I'm surprised it hasn't scaled to other communities, but it requires that kind of engagement of the parents. And if the engagement isn't there and the parents aren't committed, and if the people who are the workers in the enterprise are not interested, then you can't replicate it.
Right. It's almost, it's back to that conversation you were talking about with, finding the blended values or finding the common values, right?
Exactly.
Originally when you were talking and saying, if you were to say, I want to start something, it's even sort of, not so much I find, and you could challenge me on this, but, when you're starting a for-profit business, it's easier to find people that are aligned to the for-profit model. As opposed to, okay, let's dig deep and find out where your values really truly lie.
Yes.
And I tend to find that in the social service sector, and this is purely me, a parent like that who has a child with an intellectual disability, they're already stripped bare. So they kind of already know what their values are. Because when you get down to that microcosm of what do you stand for, when you go through that crucible and when you're there, you truly get asked those questions. So I do find it interesting in the sort of social entrepreneurship milieu that it really truly is about value. You almost have to start from that platform, and it's so important.
Yes, and the values and interests are very important to put on the table. Mm-hmm. The example that I gave there, this family knew that this young woman, at the time she was a young woman, for a lifetime would need support. She was very high functioning, but for a lifetime she would need support. They also knew that they would likely pass away before she did. So they had a sense of whatever they were creating, they needed to think of it in the long haul. They needed to know, and they could only imagine that was possible if there were more people involved and engaged in a democratic board and so on and so forth, right? Now, when you get a sole entrepreneur, and private business is great. I've been in private business for 17 years. And I can drop it anytime I want. I mean, obviously within reason for my own retirement. So I'm not independently wealthy by any stretch. But what I'm saying is, if I wanted to find a job and drop the business, it's gone.
Right.
My work has always been about community-supported economic development that had systems and structures and protocol in place where legacy would be there. And I'll give you another example. I work also in the arts community. I am an artist, and I formed a social enterprise, which is a not-for-profit textile studio cooperative. And I also engage a lot with other artists who are highly independent, obviously. They're coming from their own personal vision of art. And some of them have certainly got into the studio common space movement, right?
Right.
And I've talked with some that's set up a private enterprise as opposed to a not-for-profit cooperative, as my group of stakeholders did. And they were in debt within a few years. They were very wonderful, competent artists and administrators, but the business model was not a good fit without high engagement. Right? Whereas our cooperative with high engagement, we knew that we could all make, when we pooled our dollars every month, part of our financial model was that would cover our lease. And if we didn't have a certain number of people, our lease, we couldn't cover our lease, and therefore we were not able to survive. So we had a survival proposition, a legacy that would be left so that as younger artists came, moved on, started their own businesses, others would come in. And therefore it was there for students, it was there for older artists. So that's that kind of legacy, that thinking of interest beyond my own, that it would be there for me, but if I had to leave for whatever reason, there's a structure in place, a group of people who would carry it on, so that those like me who needed that at some point and will continue to have that need for studio space in Toronto will have that space. So what I'm experiencing these days, and I think it's just that really interesting fine line, and you're talking about it as a values fine line, is what are you in it for, truly? And to be extremely honest about it. Because if you're not in it for that long vision of creating something for others who come after you, or because you realize the need will continue, and you must set up something where that will continue to be addressed if you have the right structures in place. And there's no guarantee, of course. I don't want to be a Pollyanna here. There's no guarantee that a social agency these days will keep going. And there's no guarantee that a private business will keep going. And in fact, more often than not, more private businesses shut down the first 3 years, So we just have to be very aware of, as you say, the essential values and the essential interests in creating that enterprise. And then deciding, is it worth it? I've worked with a number of individual social entrepreneurs who are much more aligned to private business. They have an idea, they don't really want to mobilize a lot of people, have a board of directors, all that stuff, because it's perceived to be slow, pernickety, they want to move fast, and I'm going to be very honest, one of their interests is that they want to create a job for themselves. They want to create revenue that will support them as they realize this idea. I don't see anything wrong with that, but I think we do need to be aware that may mean if that person is diverted for whatever reason, the market is not good enough, they have something happen in their lives, they have a family, they do whatever, that particular enterprise is not primary, and there's no one else going to hold it up,
right?
Unless they have that engagement and that kind of model of a not-for-profit, a charitable model, a model with a community-based board of directors and high engagement, then there's no guarantee that's going to go. Now, that's not to say that some of the things that are happening in our economy these days, much more so, and you're much younger than I am, so you see the speed at which things move. Even businesses that are just escalate and then are spun off, and someone else comes in, perhaps purchases it and moves on. That's a different model from the old style, if you will, of not-for-profits and charities, which were meant to sort of address a need over time, often community-based, so that neighborhood would come to depend on it or whatever. And now we've got this global movement with things moving extremely fast, and ideas that are, tried, tested. If they succeed, they may scale very quickly, and then, the instigator may be on to something else. And that's not a world that I'm used to. I'm used to that old, and quite frankly, because I've worked in poverty reduction all my life, I can tell you, poverty has not gone away. It's increased. So homelessness continues. All these huge social issues have continued. Violence against women, all the things that I've worked on in my lifetime, Indigenous issues, they continue, and in some ways, sadly, appear not to be getting any better, and perhaps in some ways getting worse. So what is the role of the social entrepreneur in that, and what is the value and the interest in that? And that's a lot of soul searching, I have to say. And that in light of and in sort of up against this world that's really encouraging people to be creative and utilize all the technology and collaborate across boundaries. And so there's a lot of energy in that space. And there's a lot of need in that other space. So how do we marry them through social entrepreneurship, and how do we do that in a way where we might actually make some difference? And I don't have an answer to that because things are changing, but I do think values play a big role, as you described.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. It's like it's almost like we need a new sector where we said, okay, we've gotten sort of the enlightened business people, and we have the sort of enlightened not-for-profit people, and they sort of get together and they say, you know what, let's kind of leave all these conversations of black and white, us versus them aside, and what do we do?
Yeah.
You know, because it's sort of this trend, like you say, things are very fast. Like a lot of, it's sort of trendy to be social entrepreneurship, right? It's trendy to have a sustainability line item in your profit and loss statement because it makes for good investing.
Yes.
Right? Yes. So from the investor's standpoint, so, these kind of ideas that are sort of cross-pollinating right now, and you're right. So they're bringing a lot of these kind of concept of the minimum value proposition into to not-for-profit. And you're saying, okay, so how are these tackling systemic issues that we still have? Right?
Yes, exactly. And they're complex.
Yeah.
And they require, and they're systems related. Yeah. So, they're not something that a single solution will ever resolve. And so, anyone who's in this field will have to sort of bite off a piece of it. They'll have to figure out where they fit. I figured out where I fit for my career in terms of looking at mostly at collective and cooperative models. It's not exclusively, but mostly because I had a certain way of looking at the world. But where some people will need to find their place, you're right, will be very confusing because, and I agree with that thing of getting people across sectors together. In the social entrepreneurship world, in the social enterprise world, it's been really intriguing to me because we've wholesaled a lot of the business concepts into the not-for-profit sector, but we haven't wholesaled the not-for-profit values and some of what we do well within not-for-profit into the for-profit sector. And I used to say, like, if we could get that, two-way street going, it would be really exciting. And it certainly happens on the micro level, sometimes on a higher level. But the conversations are important because even in my work as a consultant in social enterprise and as I've looked at the ecosystem that's evolving these days, there's a lot more private sector intervention in the not-for-profit social enterprise world, whether it's the private sector offering pro bono support through an accelerator or whatever, or individuals who may be recruited to do supports, and coaching for not-for-profit social entrepreneurs and so on. There's all sorts of stuff going on there that virtually did not exist even 5-7 years ago. So my work has changed radically, and what I've noticed is, and have wanted to do, is have more of those conversations with people from the private sector, because when they become engaged with the not-for-profit sector, they may be frustrated because, as I said earlier, things operate differently. They're part of a much more community-engaged, community-accountable system. They have a board of directors, they have funders. Each funder requires certain kinds of reporting and accountability. They've got clients and neighborhoods who utilize the service and expect certain things or need certain things from them and so on. This is not true of business. Business can be, I believe they should be accountable to community. Not all businesses believe that. Many do, but not all do. And they're not scrutinized in the same way as not-for-profits and charities, where you've got everything you do has been, to the cent that you spend goes and has to be reported to the funder. So, a lot of private sector folks who come in looking and to support social entrepreneurs and social enterprise get frustrated because they say, I gave them a marketing plan and they didn't do anything with it, or they couldn't do it. And I thought it would be the best thing since sliced bread for them to do this, or we suggested this, but the board nixed it. And what I say to them is, it's a different world, and if you're going to work in that world, you got to get to know that world and understand the positives of that world, the reason why we have sober second thought, the reason why we utilize boards of directors, although many of them are not strong, and I think we need a lot more work with boards and governance. I think our private sector partners and supporters need to understand that world, and I've initiated some of those conversations with some of the folks too, product developers who want to come in and support social enterprises. And I say, well, we may use similar models for enterprise development pathways, but I also have an organizational development overlay on each part of that. Who needs to know? Who needs to be involved? Who's making decisions? Where are those decisions being made? So that if there's an action that's required to move a social enterprise along, you know exactly where it needs to go and who needs to decide. And you also need to understand what their capacity is to make that happen. If you give them a marketing plan and there's no one who has a job description to do marketing or sales, who hasn't got a clue because they're trained as a social worker, then, the best marketing plan in the world is not going to be realized. So that's organizational development, capacity building, engagement. And so I love those conversations because I think there's some hugely talented, well-meaning private sector folks who want to come in and work with not-for-profits. On the other hand, they need to be educated. And many not-for-profit folks maybe don't have their own sense of value and identity to know when they need to express that and voice that to them. They just think, oh, it's so great, we've got this pro bono support, and then they don't know to say, you know what, that's not how we work, or without embarrassment say, we use our board or our business advisory committee as a sober second thought place for sober, so that we don't get ourselves into trouble with our funders or with our community. Well, it's a wonderful conversation to be had, but I think it's got to be two-way, and it's got to be more equitable.
And it also brings a conversation around vulnerability, right? So whenever you put two frameworks together, you're bringing out the vulnerableness of them because they have to expose. So it puts everything on the table, the weaknesses and the strengths. And if the not-for-profit sector has to say, okay, well, we're really weak here, and it's tougher, I think, for a for-profit individual or a for-profit organization to come in and be like, well, we're weak here, because unless it's in the face of making a profit, they're gonna come in sort of with that front, and it's interesting. But I wanted to go back to a couple things that you talked about. Number one, about this, you made a really great statement about the democracy of a board, which is a great. Can you talk to me a little bit about that, like kind of what that means, like the democratic process? Because that's a really, I've never kind of thought about it that way. That's very interesting. So tell me a little bit more about that.
I will. It's a very profound concept, actually, that I think a lot of people who maybe younger or people who've been in the sector a long time have lost sight of, and because I grew up in my career as a young person, a grad assistant, a grad student, studying cooperatives, and then moved into cooperative, I was very, and I'm going to say, at the time that I was coming through university, there were a number of associated social movements that were growing in a very exciting way. There was, international solidarity movements for countries that were, for instance, apartheid was still in place and people were fighting around about apartheid, and there were other movements in Latin America. We had our cooperative movement that was growing new forms of cooperatives. We had movements working with women around many, many issues and so on. So when I came through and was studying, how can we realize these concepts of community development in the world, and also create a more equitable economy, for rural communities, urban communities, people who could participate in our economy and not be dropped off the face of it, I really studied democratic models, and that's what I meant by engagement. From the very get-go, you pick that up, and that is about people having a voice and a stake in the decisions that affect their lives. It's a very basic concept. Now, when you get to not-for-profits, which is where I chose to work, co-ops and not-for-profits, we don't articulate it quite that way. But our not-for-profit boards of directors are meant to represent a body that brings the voice of community, right? It's supposed to be there to say, are we doing the right things for this community? Are we doing it in the appropriate ways? Are we putting our community at risk, our clients at risk? Or are we doing things that are creative and innovative and so on? And they also hold the accountability for our public sector dollars that come through many social agencies, okay? So that's why a government can't give money almost, always to a private enterprise. There are means of doing that, and they do now more often than they have in the past. But governments and foundations give through charities and not-for-profits that have not-for-profit and charitable boards of directors who represent the interests of the community that those organizations meant to serve. That's a basic democratic movement. Now, I think we've lost sight of it. A couple of years ago at the Ontario Not-for-Profit Network conference in the fall, we had a fellow come up from the United States who ran the not-for-profit. I believe he was the editor of the Not-for-Profit Quarterly at the time. And they were much more politicized in the United States, as you can well imagine. It's a huge country and highly politicized in terms of the role that the not-for-profit sector plays in communities. And we're much more polite, let's say. And so he brought this message of activism to the Ontario Not-for-Profit Network conference by utilizing that word, democracy, and the importance of the not-for-profit sector in holding that democratic space. The reason being that it was communities, self-help, who were, in a sense, directing all these little organizations, whether it's a little marina not-for-profit or arts-based or a baseball, club, right up to seniors organizations, anti-poverty groups, violence against women's groups and women's centers. All of this was, in a sense, and hearkening back to that message of that woman who started the not-for-profit with her daughter, came from people determining that they had a need and that an organizational model was needed to address it. And then they brought people together to support that idea, and they created a not-for-profit or charity to carry it on through the number of years that it might be going. That's ultimately community self-determination and self-help. And I'm so fascinated with that and so committed to that in my life and in my work because, and as I say again, I'm a sole entrepreneur. So I'm not against individuals who express themselves through their businesses, through their art, through their business, through whatever, their families, whatever. But I so believe that the community needs to have that social capital and that democratic base of self-help in order to address issues and innovate and create healthy communities. And a great example of where it didn't work so well was when the Hurricane Katrina came through, and there wasn't sufficient social capital and neighborhood organizations and people who would learn to work together to resolve their issues. The churches might have been strong, but there was a lack of these neighborhood associations. Without that, you can't survive crisis. You can't survive transition. You need that. And in order to fully develop healthy communities, you need to cultivate that social capital. And one place that happens is organizations that bring in people who help direct their strategic futures through boards of directors and who learn to be leaders. they learn to be community leaders through those boards.
Right.
Right.
So that's a really interesting perspective. I mean, for me, it's sort of this idea that, using the board and that self-determination for the community. So, like you're saying, you're like, bring a board of director in to sit on a preschool board, see it through the lens of this community, and then become a leader. Go become a politician then, kind of idea, right? Like this idea that the board could be the crucible for community change is a very interesting concept.
Yes.
Very interesting thesis.
It is, and I think it's a little bit invisible, and I think our boards of directors are suffering because they have very little inputs to support them, and there are many people coming in who haven't been brought up with that sense of community accountability, mutual accountability. So they might be very strong individually, but they may be wanting to use the board to express their own ideas or influence, and sometimes that's very healthy, but quite often if you don't have a group of people who know how to negotiate those various interests into a joint proposition, a team, a joint vision, then you have very, very dysfunctional boards. But my work in the rural communities for many years, because of course in co-ops, they were in every little community across Ontario and Canada. So I did a lot of work in rural, and then when I moved into my own business doing consulting, I worked a lot again with the rural communities. And we did a lot of looking at rural leadership and innovation, and really discovered that in the rural communities, because they're smaller communities, there was a definite pathway for leadership, and often it was through perhaps a youth leadership program of some sort. In rural, it might be 4-H or junior farmers or whatever.
I remember 4-H.
Yeah, exactly. In the co-ops, we had our youth leadership programming, and that was very important because rural communities recognized that they survived based on that leadership. And so they cultivated it very young and in families and across organizations. And then those people ended up becoming the town councilors, the mayors, I can venture a guess if you took apart any one of the CVs of any politician these days, you'd find that they've been on boards of directors. They probably went through some leadership program somewhere along the line and so on. So I think it's just a lot more hidden. And with the social entrepreneurial movement right now that is very individually organized, it's sort of, as you say, it's a bit trendy, and it promotes the, look at me, I can help save this particular whatever. And again, I don't have anything, I really love that individual creativity. As an artist, I absolutely am committed to it. But I also believe that if you haven't been inculcated in that sort of world of, well, what's community made of? What are the elements of community? And how does the not-for-profit sector fit with the government, fit with the private sector, fit with, the foundations and philanthropic sector? And if we don't have that analysis of what our role might be across those fields, and understanding it's just not all about me, but it's about how that system will work better as a result of my inputs, and what kind of supports do we need, and what kind of accountability do we need to see this thing through. If we don't have that analysis, then you kind of get discouraged quickly, maybe. If your ideas got traction, maybe not for a while. You go with the traction, it's exciting, but if the traction changes or your life changes, where's the mutual proposition? Where's the community capital that's built through your ideas? And I've just been fascinated with that all my life, and committed to kind of trying to turn that innovation of the idea and the into a social proposition.
Right. Well, and I think you bring up some really great points. The perspective that you have. I mean, just even sitting here listening to you, I'm like, wow, you're right. Like this kind of that solo mio that we've been brought up with, that American Idol culture.
Yeah.
Where it's, that it really truly isn't, like that's how insurance cooperatives started, right? That's how this idea of community, and I think we're trying to rediscover it in a lot of ways. I think for a while it was sort of like, it sort of disappeared. It's like, why do I need those guys? Like you've kind of got the .com era. You've got those, that solo entrepreneur went out and they built that huge empire,
Yes.
and they became sort of our, I think that was sort of the offshoot of that whole as greed is good mantra that came out of the 80s.
Yeah.
And I think we're trying to rediscover it now because I think it's also saying it's a little hollow, because, okay, that's great, but we still had communities in which we could platform those people off of.
Yeah.
And when you ask that question, why don't we have any of those anymore? Well, I guess the question goes back to is like, well, where did they come from?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Did they have a community behind them to lift them up?
Yeah.
So, it's a really interesting, like, why don't we have innovation? Why do we have innovation crises? Is it because we're not promoting creativity? Are we not valuing our arts? Are we not valuing that, sort of just that maker concept that so many communities were built on through, the sort of even the 30s, the 40s, 50s, the 60s?
Yes.
Right?
Yes. I mean, people are very innovative. I remember working with and interviewing a young man who started a youth center in a rural community in Ontario. Very, very smart guy. And he had his own business. He was running this youth center. He was starting social enterprises all over the place. And the first thing I asked him was, "Are you a farm boy?" And the reason was he was an innovator from the get-go.
Mm-hmm.
People who were brought up on the farm knew how to resolve issues. They had to do things if something broke down, or they had to call on their community to help them if something didn't work and they had to get the harvest in or whatever. And I'm an urban person, so I don't know the full gist of it. Anyone listening to this might be mocking me at this point, but it's all right. The thing is, I value it. And this person right away said, absolutely. And I learned how to innovate by living within a business, a family business.
Right.
I had to work with weather changes and all these things, equipment breakdowns, so on.
Yeah, no, it's very true.
Yeah.
I mean, it's as a community. I was thankful I got to kind of live up it. I got the hobby farm lifestyle, so we got the pseudo farm lifestyle. But but I grew up in a very farming community, right?
Yeah.
Like we were the oddballs. And you're right. And it's funny now when I think back about it, how much, I hated it, first of all, and I spent my whole life trying to get off the farm. But when you go back to that, it's true. When I think back to it, I wouldn't have learned that if, we still had to run the tractors. You still had animals. You still had to do all those kind of things. And you don't have a choice. Do you know what I mean? You either stand up, take the lead, or you don't. And there was always somebody there. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
If there was always somebody there, that thing about the harvest and that kind of, there's always somebody there. And it's just sad that we've sort of lost that. It's almost like we need to go back and read Jane Jacobs again.
And for sure, because that was our urban version of it.
Right.
And I think I don't know if you're hearing me here. I don't know what's plugged in. What is it? Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
That you need diversity, and we have that completely in the city. I mean, it's really diverse. But we may not have the social capital that was existing and the natural capital, for that matter, in the rural communities. So I've always been someone who builds bridges between rural and urban because I believe that we again, I have a historical perspective. My mother was from the north. My dad was from the States. But we wouldn't have had a Toronto stock exchange if it weren't for the resource industries in the north. So I have a sort of historical perspective through my family, the importance of the north and the rural communities to the place that we've become as urban dwellers. And also, as you think about resilience, the resilience movement and the transition movement and environmental change and global warming, we need to be thinking about where are our strengths and where are our weaknesses. And in the city, some of our weaknesses are this lack of social capital, neighborhoods that don't really know each other. And there are some that are great, but there are some that are not. And equally, what's changing in the rural community that's actually perhaps subtracting from what was traditionally a high social capital environment, or maybe, the thing that shuts them down a bit, because they're too they're not diverse enough in the same way that the city is. So it's just a real interesting analysis of what is needed to support really good ideas to take shape, and then to be realized, to be implemented in a way that they have impact. That's the other piece of this social entrepreneurial movement. One is the ideation, the creativity, the problem solving. But the next thing is, okay, the you got to do it, right?
Yeah.
And so you'll have people in your course who'll say, I have a great idea. And I love that idea stage with the not-for-profits and co-ops I've worked with. It's very energizing. It's very exciting. The problem-solving process and the design thinking process is very, very exciting. The trick for people is the discipline to do it and to resolve issues, tinker as you go along, which is what I used to say folks who were brought up on the farm knew how to do. Tinker and be resilient and move with things and change. Adjust the model. It's not just what's in this business plan. That business plan is a sort of starting off point. Now, how are you implementing it, and how is it being realized against what you thought would happen? Now, what's your theory of what could work better? How could you introduce this? So that's a whole other process. And we're very, right now, in many ways, stuck in this ideation, exciting stage, right? Where you got an idea and I'm an entrepreneur and I'm going to do these great things. Where the rubber hits the road is really in that implementation phase, the kind of capacity it requires of individuals and groups of people, the kind of thinking that's needed, and the kind of inputs in terms of, like I say, you may have the greatest marketing plan, but if you have someone who doesn't know how to do sales, because sales is just too, below me. I don't do sales, there's that whole thing, right?
Yeah.
This person is the most important part of the puzzle in many ways. Who's going to get the stuff to the market and make people pay for it, right? Anyway, so I think that's a whole other phase that should be discussed in any social entrepreneurial environment. Is how, and it's quite hard to see that when you're in that first phase. Yeah. I have young people that I'm speaking to who just said, I need a job, I've got an idea, it has a social component, I'm going to do it. And they don't really think about that down the line. And I think that in some ways is maybe a fault of the ecosystem, that it's really into the accelerator and the getting started and then what happens when you're in that implementation phase and you need really good solid advice, solid support, solid engagement, and there's nothing there for you.
Yeah, and that's a tremendous observation. And that goes right across not-for-profit and for-profit, right? You're right, when the rubber hits the road, that's when you really ask yourself the question, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
Why am I doing this? Because it doesn't feel good right now.
It's very, very hard at that stage. And you'll have some victories, you'll have a lot of moments, down times, and you need support, and you also need certain kinds of funding or financing. You need certain kinds of protocols and systems in place, and a lot of people forget that. Oops, I didn't set up a financial system, so I don't know if I'm, selling enough. And, there are all sorts of things that you forget because we're enchanted with the idea at the early phase, and perhaps of that self-interest that we bring to it. I started a business. I had to make enough money to pay for my rent, and therefore that had to take precedence, So, but that energy and that also is a drive. I mean, the drive to survive is not a bad one. That's kept so many businesses afloat for many years.
Well, then that goes back to, again, the social capital you were talking about, right? When you get through those hard times, who do you lean on? Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah. And in that loneliness, a lot of entrepreneurs feel, social and otherwise, when they get through that. So That's cool.
Yeah, and there's some neat models for that now, the kind of shared working space models. I've been speaking with even, sons and daughters of my friends who've set up businesses, and we've talked a lot about that lack of community when you're doing a business. In this case, it's a private business. It's not a social entrepreneurial idea. But what's interesting is I'm finding a lot more young people who have multiple ideas. I'm gonna, I'm a musician. I'm gonna, create music for film on this side. But then I have this idea about how to make something good happen in the world, and I don't know how to juggle all these things all at once, and that's hard because I've worked in, for most of my early career in not-for-profit. So this is where I say the board and the systems are in place to keep you focused. Here's our mission. Here's our strategic plan. This is what our priorities are for the next few years. Here's what we have the capacity to do. This is our funding. So all these things are containers in which we strategically develop and implement our plans. Whereas an individual, it's just like, whoa, who's setting the boundaries? It's all them.
Right.
And that's hard. And they need places that they can, have someone say, hold on, hold that idea. Don't hold the thought. It's a great idea.
But
or the idea is so energizing to you right now, then you need to create that structure for it and take the risk. Because, if you let it hold it, then it's, you're going to feel at a loss in your life. You're not going to feel like you're realizing your authentic purpose. So let's look at how that can happen. So there's a lot of questions for entrepreneurs these days, social or otherwise.
Oh, yeah. Well, and you know what? I think they are truly going to change the world. Because I think they do. So on that note, this has been phenomenal. I'm just reeling now. I'm like, okay, I gotta.
You can do a whole course if you like.
That's awesome. No, this is great. It's just been so phenomenal to talk to all these different types of people, and I'm hoping, for the students, like this truly gives a perspective. Getting outside of the textbooks and just really seeing what it's all about, because there's frameworks and there's theories and we can follow them, but as you know what's in the textbook and what actually happens in real life, they often diverge. But anything, so before we sort of conclude or whatever, any advice that you have, any kind of advice whatsoever, either to people who are in not-for-profits trying to look at social enterprise, or just this person, this burgeoning entrepreneur, this burgeoning innovator, any advice that you have to them, like what do they need? What should they do? Don't turn right, turn left. What do you got?
Okay, all right. Well, I think that the most important advice I can give, and probably we've talked about this through the interview quite a bit, is to know why you're doing what you're doing and to envision what outcome you anticipate from this, so that you can design to the outcome. And then you can assess whether that's truly viable or feasible, So if it's a not-for-profit and they're discussing a social enterprise as a strategy for whether it's for client employment or, generating revenue, which are two very different things, one has to know what outcome you're hoping to achieve through it. And then really checking your assumptions as to whether this is the best route to it, the best strategy. So social enterprise, I have always said, is a strategy, a means to a goal, right? And it's a market-based means. If you discover by checking your assumptions around what outcomes you want to achieve and the strategy that you'd like to use with social enterprise, that the evidence is just not there for this to be the model. There's no financial model, or there's no comparator somewhere that's done it really well, or people have tried it and failed miserably multiple times. Then maybe you need a different model for addressing that need, or go back to that creative drawing board and figure out what it is you could really do and with whom to address that issue. And it might not be social enterprise. It might be a social program. It might be advocacy. It might be, community organizing. It could be something quite different from social enterprise. So look at what you want to accomplish. And if you're a social agency particularly, is it on mission? Is it really that outcome fit with what your mission, stated mission is, and vision of what change you want to create in the world through your not-for-profit? And then really check your assumptions about why this model, why social enterprise versus a social program advocacy, community organizing and engagement, because there are many communication, there are many different strategies for achieving different ends. And also look at what role you might play versus others. Is there someone else who would be better positioned to do this? It's not all about you as an agency. What the goal is and for whom might be addressed by another agency, organization, or even a private sector partner. If it's employment, you could work with a private sector partner and have them cultivate their awareness about how they might hire people with disabilities, for instance. So, to me, think of it as a strategy, social entrepreneurship or any kind of entrepreneurship. Think of your goal, and particularly with the private entrepreneurs, the social entrepreneurs that are not attached to not-for-profits, that are choosing the for-profit model, be very clear about your interests. Why are you doing this? What's your value? What do you want to see there in years to come? And what change do you want to see happen? Is it when you exit from this proposition, what's left? That's for the individual entrepreneur. And for the social agency, is it on mission? Does it fit? Who needs to be engaged in this decision? And, is it the best strategy? And essentially those are theory of change questions. And if you can, I'm sure with your group you can talk about theory of change, but it's really that theory of what change you're trying to make in the world, with whom, using what strategies, and what evidence is there that this is really going to make it work for those people. And if you don't have good evidence, maybe you're at a leading edge. Maybe you really are at a cutting edge, and many are, and particularly in the environmental movement and so on, where these things have not been tried. Then know the risks that you're taking, get the support you need, and the backing, and take one step at a time. But that's a little bit of the advice that I would offer.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Well, it's truly been an honor to speak with you today, and thank you so much for your time. I'm sure, so if any of our students have any questions or want to check out your website or anything, do you have a website or anything that they can go to? I mean, we'll put it in Blackboard, but it's always good to...
I use LinkedIn, so they can go to my LinkedIn profile. They can email me from there for sure. They can email me direct if you want to give them my email. They can go through the Georgian Center for Social Entrepreneurship and the Henry Bernick Center if they're starting something, and apply there to get support, because I am a coach through that system, at least for the time being. So those are some routes to getting supports.
That's fantastic.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Yeah.